Hey there, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Today, we're going to be talking about Midnight in Chernobyl by Adam Higginbotham.
Okay.
And with me, as always, I have our expert.
Hello.
So you guys wanted to know a little bit more about this book and why it's considered such an important work.
Yeah, absolutely.
And why we always say that you should be very wary of these sorts of issues. So this book kind of goes into a lot of detail about what day-to-day life was like in Pripyat.
Yeah.
Before the disaster.
He does.
And sort of paints this picture of what seems like a surprisingly normal place.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, when you think about it now, you think about this kind of like ghost town and you think about like the disaster and everything. But actually, before the disaster, Pripyat was considered a really desirable place to live in the Soviet Union.
Okay, so unpack that for me a little bit, because, I don't know if I would want to live in a town with a nuclear reactor.
Right.
How was that considered desirable?
So you've got to think about it in the context of the time, right? So this is the 1980s. This is like the peak of the Cold War.
Right.
And for the Soviet Union, nuclear power really represented progress. It represented like this bright technological future.
Okay.
And so Pripyat was kind of designed to embody that promise.
So they intentionally designed it to be an attractive place for people to live.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, like they wanted to attract families. They wanted to attract like the best and brightest minds to come and work at the plant. And they wanted to create this kind of like model city.
Okay.
And Higginbotham actually goes into a lot of detail describing like the city itself, with its modern apartments, its well-stocked shops, beautiful parks. There was even a beach where people would spend their weekends.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and there's this really interesting anecdote that he mentions about Valentina Brukhanov, who was the wife of the Chernobyl plant director. And she talks about spotting elk swimming in the river.
Wow.
And it just kind of emphasizes this idea that, normalcy and nature were coexisting in this, like, atomic town, which makes the impending disaster all the more shocking.
Yeah, it's like one of those, disaster movies where everything's, really peaceful and, too perfect and, something bad is about to happen.
Exactly. And you get that sense when you're reading the book as well. Like, there's this palpable sense of foreboding that kind of, permeates the early chapters.
Okay.
As Higginbotham is introducing us to these key players, like Viktor Brukhanov, who was the plant director.
Yeah.
And, he was a man who was clearly dedicated to his job, but also seemed to be deeply aware of the immense responsibility that was weighing on his shoulders.
So he wasn't just some clueless bureaucrat who was like, oh yeah, nuclear reactor, what could go wrong?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Higginbotham portrays him as a really complex figure, actually.
Okay.
He talks about how he was incredibly overworked, how he was often surviving on coffee and cigarettes,
Oh, God.
pushing himself to meet these demanding production quotas that were set by the Soviet government.
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Exactly.
Literally.
And this is where I think that culture of secrecy that we always talk about becomes really crucial to understanding what happened at Chernobyl.
Okay.
Because the Soviet system was really built on this idea of control, right?
Right.
Maintaining this image of infallibility.
Yeah.
So admitting weakness, even acknowledging that there could be potential risks, was seen as a sign of, incompetence or weakness.
So if there was something wrong at the power plant, would there even have been any incentive to report that?
No, not really.
Okay.
And in fact, Higginbotham actually cites instances where prior warnings about the reactor safety were either ignored or deliberately suppressed.
Completely ignored. This
Yeah.
is a nuclear reactor. This isn't just like a toaster oven that's not working.
I know,
Wow.
and it's kind of crazy to think about. But the pressure to meet those production targets combined with this deep-seated fear of appearing incompetent, it really created this environment where safety took a back seat.
Oh, wow.
And that's a recurring theme, I think, in the book,
Yeah.
this clash between ambition and responsibility.
Right.
And how it ultimately set the stage for the disaster.
Okay, so we've talked about the town, we've talked about the people, we've talked about this culture of secrecy.
Right.
But we haven't actually talked about the elephant in the room, or should I say, the reactor in the power plant.
So tell me a little bit about this infamous RBMK reactor.
Yeah, so that's where things get really interesting
Okay.
and terrifying. So the RBMK reactor, it was kind of like this product of its time,
Right.
This
Yeah.
is when the Soviet Union was really obsessed with showcasing their technological might,
Right.
bigger is better kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So we're talking about a reactor that was designed to be really powerful
Yeah.
to generate tons of electricity.
Exactly.
But I mean, like we always say, bigger isn't always better, right?
Right.
So what were like the downsides of this massive power?
Well, that's the thing about the RBMK reactor.
Okay.
It had some inherent design flaws,
Right.
flaws that Higginbotham really lays bare in chilling detail in the book.
Okay.
It was inherently unstable. So
Okay.
kind of like a high performance car, but with like a faulty braking system,
Yeah, I get it.
And as with any complex system, like the more moving parts you have, the more opportunities there are for something to go wrong.
Right. So they basically took this inherently unstable reactor.
Mm-hmm.
They put it in the hands of people who were terrified to like admit to any mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And then they piled on all this pressure to keep production high.
Yeah.
It's like they were trying to create a disaster.
It's a chillingly accurate analogy, actually.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the night of April 25th, 1986.
Okay.
The night that everything changed.
Yeah.
Higginbotham actually takes us minute by minute through the events that led up to the explosion.
Wow.
He introduces us to the operators who were on duty that night, like Alexander Akimov, who was this really skilled engineer.
Okay.
But he was known for like following orders to a fault.
So this is where like the human element of this story really starts to come out, right? Because these aren't just like names in a history book.
Yep.
These are like real people who are now facing this like unimaginable situation.
Exactly. And Higginbotham does such a good job of like bringing them to life.
Okay.
You know, he highlights their expertise, their flaws,
Yeah.
the immense pressure that they were under
Right.
within this Soviet system.
Because it wasn't their fault that the reactor was designed the way it was.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. And he even introduces us to like Leonid Toptunov,
Okay.
who was this young engineer who had dreamed of working at Chernobyl since he was a boy.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine?
It's kind of heartbreaking to think
Yeah.
about these guys just going about their jobs and having no idea what's
Right.
about to happen.
And what's crazy is that they were actually performing a safety test that night.
Oh, wow. So they were doing something that was supposed to make it safer.
I know it's kind of ironic, but this was not your typical safety check.
Okay.
This test was riddled with flaws from the start.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, the reactor was operating at extremely low power,
Okay.
which it wasn't really designed for.
So they were basically messing with something that they shouldn't have been messing with.
Pretty much.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And Higginbotham describes all these like miscommunications, delays, poor judgment calls
Wow.
that in retrospect seem almost unbelievable.
Yeah.
But again, you know, these weren't like malicious acts. These were human errors
Right.
made under immense pressure and compounded by this system that discouraged any kind of dissent.
Right. It's like if you see something, say something, but also like don't say anything.
Exactly.
Oh, my God. Okay. So then what happened?
So then the explosion,
Right.
and Higginbotham's writing in these moments is just absolutely gripping.
What?
Like, he doesn't shy away from the sheer terror of it all,
Yeah.
the blinding flash, the deafening roar that just ripped through the night.
Oh, my God.
And he recounts these experiences of the firefighters who were the first ones to arrive on the scene.
Right.
And they mistook the burning graphite for ordinary debris.
So they had no idea what they were dealing with.
No, they had no idea they were walking into a nuclear inferno.
Oh, my God. That's terrifying. And they didn't have any of the like protective gear or anything.
Right, like they had canvas uniforms and helmets.
Oh, my God.
That was it.
Against like invisible radiation.
I know, it's crazy.
Oh, my gosh.
But they charged into the heart of this disaster with just unimaginable bravery.
Yeah.
And so many of them paid the ultimate price.
Yeah.
And, you know, their heroism is really a testament to the human spirit's ability to confront the unthinkable.
Yeah. Like, what do you even do in that situation? Like,
Right.
how do you even process that?
Exactly. And amidst all of this, you have this Soviet machine that's so used to control.
Right.
Really struggling to grasp the magnitude of what had just happened.
Yeah. Like, how do you even begin to control this?
Right.
Like, radiation is invisible.
Exactly. You know, and you read these accounts and there's this eerie calmness.
Wow.
Like this terrifying mix of disbelief and denial.
It's like a nightmare that you can't wake up from.
Exactly.
Okay.
So what happens next? Do they evacuate Pripyat, like, right away?
You would think so, right?
Yeah, because there's an explosion at a nuclear reactor.
Right. But remember that culture of secrecy that we talked about?
Oh, no.
Yeah. It extended even to this moment of crisis.
Oh, my God.
The Soviet authorities were so desperate to maintain control that they actually downplayed the severity of the situation,
No.
both to the outside world and to the people of Pripyat.
They didn't tell their own people.
No.
It's crazy how they thought they could keep that under wraps.
I know, right? Like, how do you even try to hide something like that?
Right.
Well, they couldn't.
Yeah.
As much as the Soviet authorities wanted to control the narrative, the truth started to seep out, literally in the form of radiation spreading across Europe.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So how did people find out? Like, were there like alarm bells going off everywhere?
Well, ironically, it was actually Sweden,
Okay.
hundreds of miles away, that first detected these unusually high levels of radiation.
Oh, wow.
And they were able to trace it back to the Soviet Union,
Oh.
which kind of forced them to finally acknowledge that something had gone really wrong at Chernobyl.
Okay, so the cat was out of the bag.
Yeah, exactly.
But even then, they didn't like fully come clean, right?
No, not entirely. It was more of like a grudging admission.
Okay.
This carefully worded statement acknowledging that there had been an accident at the Chernobyl power plant.
Right.
But of course, they still tried to downplay the severity and the potential risks.
Wow. So even then, even when they were facing like international pressure,
Yeah.
they still wanted to try to like control the narrative.
Right.
It's kind of scary how deep that runs in their system.
Yeah, it really shows you how ingrained that secrecy was in the Soviet system.
Yeah, for sure. But while like the higher ups are trying to figure out like what story they're going to tell people,
Right.
there are people who are living through this like horrific reality.
It is.
So this is where we get to the evacuation of Pripyat.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So finally, over 36 hours after the explosion.
Wow, that's so long.
I know, right?
Oh my gosh.
The order finally came to evacuate the city.
Oh,
Can you imagine that?
no.
Being told to pack a bag,
Yeah.
leave your home your entire life behind,
With no notice.
and no idea if you'll ever be back.
Oh my God. It's like, what would you even grab?
I know.
Like if you only had a few minutes to leave your home forever.
Exactly. And this is where I think Higginbotham's writing really shines.
Okay.
Because he doesn't just like recount the events.
Right.
He makes you feel them.
Wow.
He tells the story of the evacuation through the eyes of the people who lived through it.
Okay.
He captures their fear, their confusion, their quiet acts of courage,
Yeah.
in the face of the unknown.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to like read the statistics, like,
Right.
okay, this is the radiation level and this is how many people had to leave their homes.
Right.
But it's a totally different thing to hear the personal story
Exactly.
of the people who were there.
And those stories don't end with the evacuation of Pripyat.
Right, because then there's the cleanup.
Exactly.
Right. And who's doing the cleanup?
Right. So that's where we get to the liquidators.
Okay.
These thousands of men and women
Okay.
who were tasked with this, like, near impossible job of containing this disaster.
So we're not just talking about like the first responders anymore?
No.
Okay.
These are the people who are in it for the long haul.
Okay.
These are the miners who are tunneling beneath the burning reactor.
Oh, wow.
The soldiers who are clearing radioactive debris.
Wow.
The pilots who flew countless missions over the reactor.
Wow. And they knew
And many of them knew.
that this was dangerous.
The risks, they knew they were being exposed to potentially lethal doses of radiation.
Yeah.
And yet they still answered the call.
It's kind of amazing, like that selflessness.
It really is.
To put yourself in danger for other people like that?
It's remarkable. And, in a lot of cases, they didn't even have proper protective gear.
They didn't.
No, especially not in the beginning.
Oh, my God.
Higginbotham talks about how many liquidators were sent into the heart of this disaster.
Yeah.
With really inadequate protection sometimes, with nothing more than their regular work clothes.
Oh, my God.
And like a flimsy respirator mask.
That's terrifying.
No.
It's like they were hailed as heroes, but it's like
Oh.
they were treated as disposable.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that seemed to be a recurring theme.
Yeah, like it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission.
Yeah, pretty much.
Oh, my God. But then there's the reactor itself.
Right,
Like, what do they even do with that?
right. So Higginbotham describes the construction of the sarcophagus.
Yes.
This massive concrete and steel structure
Yeah.
that was hastily built to contain the radioactive remains of reactor number 4.
It's crazy how they were able to do that.
It really is an incredible feat of engineering when you think about it.
Yeah.
They were working under incredibly dangerous conditions.
Right.
It was a race against time to contain the radiation and prevent further contamination.
It's like a science fiction movie almost.
It kind of is, right?
Like they had to build this giant tomb to encase this like monster.
Yeah, and he talks about the sheer scale of this project,
Yeah.
thousands of workers, the constant threat of radiation,
Right.
this fear that the molten core, what they called the elephant's foot, might actually melt through the concrete and contaminate the groundwater.
Elephant's foot. What is that?
So the elephant's foot is this massive solidified chunk of highly radioactive material.
Okay.
It's a mixture of like melted reactor core and concrete
Okay.
that formed in the basement of the reactor building.
Okay.
And it's like one of the most dangerous objects on Earth.
Wow.
It emits these lethal doses of radiation.
Oh my God.
But thankfully, the sarcophagus held.
Okay, good.
At least for a while.
Right.
It was never intended to be a permanent solution.
Okay.
And in recent years, they've actually built a new, larger containment structure
Wow.
over the old sarcophagus, just to kind of like really try to contain everything.
Oh, wow.
So it's a testament to the ongoing legacy of Chernobyl
Right.
and the enduring challenge of containing its radioactive threat.
So after learning all this, what are we supposed to take away from this?
Well, that's the question that Higginbotham really wants us to wrestle with.
Okay.
You know, Chernobyl, for all its horrors, is ultimately a story about us,
Okay.
about humanity's capacity for both brilliance and blunder,
Right.
about the unintended consequences of our actions, and this enduring need for transparency, accountability,
Yes.
and humility in a world that's increasingly reliant on complex technologies.
Yeah. You know, it's one thing to have these technologies, but it's another thing to, like, know how to use them safely.
Exactly.
Yeah. And to be able to admit when we make a mistake.
Absolutely.
And that's what this book is really about. It's not just a history book, it's a cautionary tale.
It is.
So if you guys are interested in learning more about midnight in Chernobyl and kind of like diving deeper into the story,
Please do.
we have an affiliate link down in the description.
Check it out.
And yeah, that's it for this deep dive. We'll see you guys next time.